I've shared with you 11 different ways to deal with the changes that you're experiencing. Before I go into another part of this particular lecture, let me just share one story with you in this whole area of leave me alone. There's a time our daughter came home and she walked into the house, threw her bag down, entered the bedroom and banged the door. And very unusual for our daughter to do that. She was in high school, about age 16, and by her non-verbal communication, she was saying, "Leave me alone." Well, we left her alone for a while, and then I went to the kitchen and fixed 2 cups of tea, and then I went to her bedroom door and knocked on it. And she said, "Who is it?" I said, "It's Dad bringing you a cup of tea." There's a bit of silence, and he said, "Come in, Dad." And so I went in, and she was lying on her bed, and she sat up on her bed, and I gave her a cup of tea, and I sat on a chair. She had a desk in her room, so I sat on that chair, and I sipped my tea while she sipped her tea. There was an awkward silence between us. Then I asked her, "Mindy, was it the chemistry teacher?" She said, "No, Dad." "Psychology exam?" "No, Dad." You see, I couldn't ask those questions unless I had been able to connect with her at the intellectual level and be able to know what was going on. And then finally she sat up and said, "Dad, boys are stupid." And the only appropriate answer was, "Of course they are. What happened?" And she went on to tell me how her best friend, her girlfriend, had just been dropped by the boyfriend. You see, we had the level of communication where we could talk about those things. And so this whole idea of leave me alone, a child does want to be left alone, and we do need to leave them alone for a while. But we need wisdom in knowing how to reconnect with them. I don't know what you are going through in your own home, where a child puts up a wall and you don't know how to get across. You need to build a safe environment that allows that child to come out of their hiding. Okay, let's move on in this whole area of coping with changes. Parents, you need to remember that children are growing. Whether you are ready for it or not, they are growing. Your 12-year-old will become 13. Your 12-year-old is ready to become 13. Maybe it's you who is not ready for them to become 13. We cannot delay the growth. We cannot retard it. We cannot reverse it. The only thing we can do is to cooperate with it. Sometimes you meet parents who say, "I'm not ready for my child to be 13. Well, you may not be ready. The child is ready. So the parent does need to grow up and get themselves ready on what to do when that child turns 13. Remember, parents, nothing magical happens when the child becomes a teenager. The transition begins from age 9 and goes all the way to age 21. So don't start dreading when your child becomes a teenager. Just get that thing out of your mind and look at that 13th birthday as just another birthday. Now, there are 4 main considerations I'd like us to look through in this particular lecture. I'll begin them in this lecture and complete them in the next session. There are 4 areas. The first area, we're going to look at some key terms for contrast. Then we'll look at goals for contrast. Thirdly, we'll look at objectives for contrast. And then lastly, we'll look at context of ministry. Let's begin by looking at terms for contrast. And the approach I'm going to take here is the approach of the terminology we use in raising young children and the terminology that we use when raising our adolescents. So first, when we are looking at young children, Ephesians 6:1 says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right." Children, that's a big emphasis. But now, as we are getting into the teenage stage of life, we want to look at what 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 18 says. "I will be a father to you. You shall be sons and daughters to me, says the Lord Almighty." So we are transitioning from children to sons and daughters. So parents need to discipline themselves to begin to think of their offspring, to begin to think of their teenagers, not as children, but as sons and daughters. Remember the statement I made earlier? Our children will always be our children, but our children will not always be children. And this is a stage where they are transitioning from being a child to becoming an adult. Simply refer to them as my son or my daughter, not as my child. And that helps you to realize they are growing up. The second term I'd like us to look at is the term obey versus honor. Ephesians 6:1 says, children, obey your parents. But when it comes to honor, it doesn't say children honor your parents. It simply says honor your father and mother. The command to honor was so important to God that it made it to the top 10. You know what I mean by that? It's among the 10 commandments. And it simply says honor your father and mother. Whereas children must obey, all of us must honor. And so we need to begin to transition from a place of simply getting obedience. Discipline yourself as a parent to require honor from your sons and daughters instead of just requiring mere obedience. This is going to be a big one for many parents, especially their fathers, who want obedience at every stage. You need to transition from obedience to honor. When the children honor you, they'll also obey you. But it's you shifting your thinking from obedience to honor. The third term is the term under control and the term glad heart. 1 Timothy 3:4, in talking about those desiring a position of a deacon in the church, it says he must have his household under control with all dignity. Children need to be under the control of their parents. And by under control, I don't mean manipulative control, but under control with dignity. But as they are growing older and they are not getting out of control, they are honoring you and they are bringing you a glad heart. You are not necessarily controlling them. You are releasing them. You are rejoicing in their independence. You as a parent need to discipline yourself to rejoice in your sons and daughters' accomplishments rather than continuing to require them to be under your control. I know parents whose married sons and daughters are still completely under their control, and that's a disaster. Moving from terms, let's look at some goals for contrast. Goals for contrast. And I'm going to be talking again, comparing the raising of young children to the raising of teenagers. The first two sets of words I want us to look at is training versus cheering. Now, in training, you are building a foundation for the child that will help them and serve them in future. But now, as that child becomes an adolescent, you realize that the future has come. The future has come. You now need to motivate and encourage the young person to step out on his own. Your new goal is to encourage and reward good decision making as the child grows in independence from us. You want to realize I'm no longer just training, I'm going to be cheering them as they get older. The second goal for contrast is the contrast between the two terms, nurturing versus letting go. Nurturing versus letting go. In nurturing, there's an aspect of protection and care. But in letting go, you're allowing the child to make decisions and fend for themselves. And in trying to focus on how do I let go and in what areas do I let go. You see, your child, as they are growing up, you are buying clothes for them. Now you're letting go, letting them buy clothes for themselves. You are taking them to the hairdresser and choosing their hairstyle. You're letting go, letting them choose their own hairstyle. You are very strict on the time for going to bed and the time for waking up. Now you are letting go because the homework of this growing child is going beyond those hours. You used to give them a ride everywhere they wanted, and now you want them to begin to take public means so that they can also be able to explore their world and get independent for college. You need to let them go and not continue nurturing them as they're getting to the teenage years.